Some truths are not erased by time, but by the ink of a false hand. It begins with a forgotten diary, found among dusty boxes, its pages bearing words that seem to belong to Dr. Watson himself, yet tell of meetings and misdeeds he cannot remember. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The shadows of deceit have already been cast. Let us walk beside Holmes as he lifts them, page by page, to the light of truth. It was upon a quiet afternoon, when the rush of patience had left me with a rare interlude of leisure, that I resolved to undertake a modest task long deferred: the clearing of a set of boxes which had lain untouched in the corner of my study since my removal from Kensington to my present rooms. Dust lay thick upon them, the very cobwebs spun across their lids a reproach to my neglect, and as I drew them forth, I was struck by the faint, peculiar odour of time itself, mingled with that of old leather and paper. One by one, I set their contents in order, unearthing forgotten pamphlets, military notes, and letters yellowed by age. It was in the midst of this sorting that my hand fell upon a small diary, its brown calf binding worn, its clasp tarnished by years of disregard. I recalled dimly that I had once employed such volumes to record appointments and stray reflections, yet I could not at once place this particular one. The faded initials embossed upon the cover, my own J.H.W., stirred a gentle wave of recollection, like a half-remembered melody whose words remain elusive. With a sense of both curiosity and tenderness, I carried it to my desk and drew open its stiffened clasp. The pages crackled faintly as I turned them, and the sight that greeted me brought my hand to a halt. In neat, deliberate strokes unmistakably my own, I beheld entries dated across the course of several weeks, noting incidents of which I had no memory whatsoever. The penmanship, the very slow whisper of fever or delirium had clouded my mind. The idea of some lapse or unconscious wandering of memory could not be sustained against the firm testimony of those around me at the time. As I traced the later pages, the mystery deepened rather than diminished. The entries shifted from the trivial to the cryptic, noting places of assignation in vague terms: the garden by the railings, or the corner seat beneath the lamp. There were half-phrases hinting at business transacted in secrecy, of a gentleman in grey gloves, and the bargain sealed with a promise. The effect upon me was most disquieting, for it seemed as though my hand had been made to conspire with some hidden purpose, the nature of which was veiled in sinister ambiguity. I lingered over one page in particular, where a passage suggested a meeting in Baker Street itself, at an hour I knew with certainty I had spent at home in peaceful reading. The juxtaposition of memory and manuscript was intolerable to reason. At length a chill passed over me, for I perceived the darker possibility that lay within these pages. If these words were indeed mine, then they accused me of clandestine dealings of which I had no conscious share. But if they were not mine, if some other had imitated my script with such cunning exactitude, then the matter pointed to a design far more alarming: that I was the object of a deliberate fraud, contrived to involve me in suspicions of dishonour. The thought of my name, my reputation, my loyalty to friends, all compromised by a villain's counterfeit hand, filled me with a mingled sense of anger and dread. I sat with the diary open before me, the dim light of the study falling upon its deceptive pages, and felt the weight of a mystery that seemed at once deeply personal and perilously grave. It was with considerable agitation that I carried the diary to Baker Street upon the following morning. The weight of that small volume pressed heavily upon my conscience, for I could not shake the uneasy conviction that it had been designed, whether by fate or malice, to compromise my honor. As I entered our familiar sitting room, I found Holmes in his customary chair by the fire, his long, lean figure enveloped in his dressing gown, a cloud of blue smoke curling upward from his pipe. For a time I hesitated, reluctant to confess, even to him, the peculiar circumstances that had disturbed me. Yet friendship and long habit prevailed over pride, and at last I laid the diary upon the table, relating, with as much composure as I could summon, the strange entries I had found in what should have been the most innocent of personal records. Holmes listened without interruption, his sharp grey eyes fixed upon me, though I fancied that their brightness quickened at each detail I gave. He stretched out his hand, and I placed the book in his grasp. He turned it over with the cool deliberation of a surgeon examining a specimen, his thin lips pressed together in silent concentration. "My dear Watson," said he at last, "you bring me no ordinary matter. You know as well as I do that a man's diary is a mirror of his soul, however clouded. Yet here we are presented not with your own reflection, but with a shadow designed to resemble you. Let us see whether we can distinguish the shade from the substance." There was no surprise in his tone, only the quiet relish of one confronted with an intellectual puzzle worthy of his attention. Holmes drew the lamp nearer and bent over the pages with his lens. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The ink here is of a curious irregularity. These lines, ostensibly written upon successive days, betray shades that no continuous pen could have produced. Some are browned by time, while others retain a gloss as though set down but yesterday. Would your diary of a single season anew at the depth of his observation, for I should have passed over such details without a second thought." Holmes leaned back, and with a sudden gesture read aloud a line that had caught his attention. "At the corner by the lamp, the promise was exchanged." In silence, he closed the book and regarded me with a faint smile. "Do you, Watson, in all your straightforward honesty, ever employ such phrasing? I have read your prose, both in your medical notes and in your published accounts of our adventures. You write with clarity and vigour, but not with such contrived obscurity. Here we perceive the betraying mark of imitation, a counterfeit hand that succeeds in form, but falters in spirit." His voice held no reproach, only the measured satisfaction of an anatomist laying bare the structure beneath the surface. At length he set the diary aside with finality. "The verdict, Watson, is clear," said he, his tone calm yet weighty. "We are dealing with forgery, not a clumsy imitation, but a design executed with malicious precision. Some enemy has sought to clothe their own fabrications in the guise of your hand, that the shadow of guilt might fall upon you, or, more likely, upon others through you. This is no chance scribbling, but the deliberate work of one who knows you well and has access to your manner of life." He regarded me with a rare gentleness as he concluded, "Rest assured, my friend, your honour stands unblemished. The deception lies not within your soul, but in the craft of a cunning adversary." Our deliberations upon the forged diary had scarcely concluded when the quiet of Baker Street was interrupted by the sound of a timid knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young lady whose countenance bore all the traces of agitation and weariness. Her pallor was such that one might have thought her newly risen from an illness, yet her eyes shone with a fevered brightness which spoke rather of anxiety than of disease. She clasped her hands tightly together, as though in a struggle to maintain her composure. Holmes rose courteously to greet her, but I observed that his gaze had already fastened upon the smallest details of her appearance: the worn hem of her gown, the frayed stitching of her gloves, and the ink stains upon her fingertips. For my own part, I confess I was touched by the evident distress of our visitor, and I hastened to offer her a chair near the fire, hoping its warmth might afford some measure of comfort. After a moment's pause, she gave her name as Miss Eleanor Fenton. Her voice, though low, carried with it a dignity which not even hardship had been able to extinguish. She told us that her family had once occupied a respectable position in society, their household conducted with propriety, and their affairs prosperous. But a calamity, long past in years though not in consequence, had cast a shadow upon their lives. The weight of that disaster, she confessed, had driven her now to seek the aid of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. With trembling lips, she proceeded to recount the particulars. Some 15 years before, her late father, Mr. Charles Fenton, had been entrusted with the safekeeping of a jewelled snuff-box belonging to a nobleman who had visited their home. The trinket, of considerable value and greater sentiment, vanished during the visit, and suspicion fell heavily upon her father. No formal charge was ever brought, yet rumour is often more destructive than law, and the family's name was irreparably tarnished. The elder Mr. Fenton, unable to endure the silent censure of his acquaintances, had withdrawn into bitterness and decline, until death relieved him of his shame. As she spoke, her voice faltered, and she clasped her hands yet more tightly, as if the memory of that ruin pressed upon her afresh. I confess that I was moved by her sincerity. There was in her bearing no hint of exaggeration, but rather the simple pain of one who has lived too long beneath an unjust reproach. Holmes, however, remained composed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin.
Others plotted to retain what was never his. They insist that Dr. Watson's diary corroborates the tale, but I know it cannot be true. My father, though stern, was honourable, and I will not believe that an upright gentleman such as Dr. Watson could have written words that condemn him. Her eyes turned imploringly to me, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. It was strange indeed to hear my name linked so intimately with her family's ruin, and I muttered some broken assurance of my innocence. Holmes had listened with perfect composure, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed steadily upon the young lady. When she faltered, he spoke in tones at once grave and soothing. "You do well, Miss Fenton, to seek assistance, for truth has a curious habit of hiding in plain sight, and falsehood of proclaiming itself too loudly. Let us, if you will permit, examine not only the evidence, but the manner in which it is employed." He leaned forward slightly, his penetrating eyes never leaving her face. "You speak with admirable conviction of your father's honour, yet you hesitate, Miss Fenton. When recalling the chain of events, was it that you were young at the time, or that some details remain too painful to disclose?" She coloured faintly, and for the briefest instant her gaze shifted away. I was but a girl, Mr. Holmes. Much of what I know is second-hand, drawn from whispers and recollections. The memory of it all is oppressive. Holmes inclined his head in sympathy, but I knew him too well not to perceive the spark of alertness in his eye. To me, he later remarked that the truest words are often spoken through the smallest betrayals of countenance. A hesitation here, a averted glance there. Yet in that moment, he merely allowed her to continue, his voice gentle, his manner unthreatening, while his mind, as I could see, probed the recesses of her testimony. At length, her tale told, Miss Fenton rose to depart. Holmes accompanied her courteously to the door, offering no hint of the conclusions which even then were forming in his mind. When her light step had faded down the stairs, I turned to him in perplexity. "Surely," I exclaimed, "you are convinced of her sincerity. The poor girl has suffered enough from this vile fabrication." Holmes smiled faintly, drawing his dressing gown more closely about him. "My dear Watson, sincerity is no guarantor of truth. Miss Fenton's distress is genuine. Of that I have no doubt. But mark you well the precision with which her story was laid before us. Too precise, perhaps, a recital rehearsed as carefully as an actress delivering her lines. That which is true needs no embellishment, and that which is false often betrays itself by excess of detail." He took up the diary once more and tapped it lightly with his long forefinger. "We have, my friend,
a tale that is older and darker than our visitor allowed us to perceive. The shadow of the past stretches further than she supposes. Let us tread carefully, for we walk now on ground prepared by another hand. The following morning saw Holmes and myself bound upon the road to Surrey, whither Miss Fenton's message had directed us. The air was chill, and the sky overcast, the hedgerows beaded with lingering mist that clung like melancholy to the fields. As the hansom carried us farther into the countryside, I could not resist a reflection upon the sorrow that attends a name once respectable, yet fallen into suspicion. Holmes sat beside me, silent, save for an occasional remark upon the features of the landscape, but I knew from the tension of his long fingers drumming against the seat that his mind was at full work. For my own part, I could not help but think of the young lady's pale countenance and the grief with which she had spoken of her father. That a family should suffer years of reproach for an accusation had nearly effaced them. Our summons at the door was answered by a servant of forbidding aspect, who led us without warmth into a hall where shadows hung thick, despite the hour of day. There we were met by Mr. Henry Fenton, Eleanor's elder brother, a man of middle years whose expression combined pride with bitterness in equal measure. His manner was abrupt, and scarcely had we introduced ourselves when he broke into a torrent of reproach. "So, gentlemen, my sister brings strangers to pry yet again into a scandal long dead, though it still suffices to blacken the name of Fenton. Have we not suffered enough? Must we endure inquisitors in our very home, as though we were felons under examination?" His voice rang with indignation, and his heavy brow knitted in anger as he spoke. Holmes, unruffled as ever, received the man's hostility with a slight inclination of the head, while I, in my capacity as physician and friend, endeavoured to soothe him with a few words of courtesy. Yet it was plain to see that the wound of his father's disgrace had never healed, but had instead festered into a bitterness that coloured his every thought. He paced the hall in agitation, railing against the whispers of society, the cowardice of so-called friends, and the shame of a charge never proven, yet never forgotten. Even as he spoke, however, I observed that he cast furtive glances toward the staircase, as though uneasy of some unseen witness. Holmes's eyes followed those glances with interest, but he uttered not a syllable, and I perceived that he had marked more in Mr. Henry Fenton's vehemence than mere wounded pride. While Mr. Henry Fenton's voice still echoed through the hall, Holmes turned his attention to a figure who had lingered silently at the edge of our arrival. It was Mrs. Arden, the housekeeper, a woman of advanced years, her form bent, but her eyes sharp with a kind of watchful caution. She had been in service to the family since before Eleanor's birth, and her presence carried that air of authority which attaches itself to those who have outlasted generations of masters. Holmes addressed her with a courtesy that was as probing as it was gentle. "You have known this household through prosperity and adversity alike, Mrs. Arden," said he, "and few could speak with more knowledge of the truth than yourself. Tell me, do you recall the unhappy incident of the nobleman's visit?" Her hands tightened upon the apron she wore, and her eyes flickered briefly toward Henry before she replied. "I was in the house at the time, sir, but such things are not for me to speak upon. The family has borne enough shame without a servant adding to it." Her tone was deferential, yet beneath it I detected the trace of something withheld. Not ignorance, but reluctance. Holmes, with that quiet persistence which I had so often witnessed, pressed her a little further, drawing from her short, half answers that she had known of the snuff-box's existence, had seen it placed in Mr. Fenton's keeping, and had been present in the house on the day it vanished. Yet each admission was given grudgingly, as though she weighed every word against some private fear. It was Henry who, unable to restrain himself, burst out afresh. "This cursed box! Must we endure the eternal repetition of its name?" My father was accused, condemned in whispers, and driven to his grave by it. "We have no more to say." His voice shook with indignation, and he paced with clenched fists, his bitterness laid bare. But Holmes, unmoved by the outburst, kept his gaze fixed upon the housekeeper. Seldom march in step, but the false tongue falters most when in the company of passion. I shall not say which of the two withheld the greater portion of truth, but rest assured that between them lies the key to this unhappy mystery. It was upon the following afternoon, while Holmes and I were engaged in quiet discussion over the details of our Surrey visit, that the bell rang sharply, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade. Our acquaintance from Scotland Yard entered with his customary briskness, his manner betraying the self-assurance of one already in possession of a solution. His bow was perfunctory, and without so much as removing his gloves, he declared that our inquiries were unnecessary, for the affair was, in his words, as plain as daylight. Holmes motioned him to a chair with polite indifference, and I confess I felt a flicker of relief that some official light might be shed upon our dark perplexity. Yet I could not help but notice the faint quirk of Holmes's lip, as though he found entertainment in the inspector's certainty, even before it had been expressed. Without preamble, Lestrade laid out his case. The diary, he asserted, was no elaborate forgery devised by enemies unknown, but the work of Miss Eleanor Fenton herself. "You see, gentlemen," said he, with a tap upon the volume that lay upon Holmes's desk, "the young lady stands to gain by presenting her family as victims of injustice. By forging these passages in Dr. Watson's hand, she casts doubt upon the guilt of her late father, and appeals to the sympathy of those willing to assist a lady wronged by cruel society. A clever ploy, is it not? Secure pity, perhaps a subscription or two, and wipe the slate clean." His small eyes glittered with the satisfaction of a theory neatly contrived. The suggestion struck me with some indignation, for the thought that Miss Fenton's pale sincerity might be mere artifice seemed almost an insult to the grief we had witnessed. Holmes, however, betrayed no such emotion. He leaned forward slightly, his long fingers interlaced, and said in his quietest tone, "Your argument, Lestrade, rests upon the assumption that Miss Fenton not only possessed the skill to imitate Dr. Watson's hand to perfection, but also the opportunity to obtain his private diary unnoticed. Have you considered whether such conditions were possible?" Lestrade shifted in his seat, though he pressed on with his reasoning. "Opportunity? Why, she could have seen any of his published accounts and derived the hand from that. And as for skill, desperation breeds ingenuity." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his smile barely perceptible. "Published accounts, Inspector, are set in type, not in script. To mimic a man's pen is a different art from copying his words. And do you suppose that desperation teaches one not only the form of letters, but their very pressure, spacing, and unconscious irregularities?" Lestrade made a non-committal grunt, unwilling to concede, yet unable to counter the force of the argument. I could not refrain from recording my own impression at that moment. Lestrade, like many in authority, found satisfaction in a solution that suited appearances and quieted public curiosity, while Holmes's standard was ever higher, truth itself, regardless of its comfort or convenience. Where Lestrade saw plausibility enough for the law, Holmes sought inevitability born of logic. It was a contrast that struck me more keenly each time I observed them in company. At length, the inspector, dissatisfied that his explanation had not been embraced with enthusiasm, rose and declared that he would proceed with his report regardless. Holmes bade him good day with perfect courtesy, and when the door had closed behind him, he turned to me with that grave air which accompanied his rare moments of fascination and perplexity. For while I had studied those pages until my eyes grew weary, they had given me nothing but unease and contradiction. Holmes, however, handled the volume with the tenderness of a botanist turning the leaves of a rare specimen. He bent his keen gaze upon it once more, as if listening for a whisper that had eluded us before. Drawing the lamp closer, Holmes lifted one of the pages to the light. "Ah," he murmured, his eyes kindling with that peculiar brightness which came to him in moments of discovery. "Do you perceive, Watson, the faint tracery here? Not the ink itself, but the shadow of ink, transferred from another sheet." I leaned in and saw, though dimly, that there were indeed impressions upon the paper, as if a blotting pad had once pressed against it. They were not immediately legible, but under the slant of the lamplight, certain words began to take ghostly shape, like writing glimpsed through a veil. The sight sent a curious thrill through me, an echo of another's hand lingering beyond the reach of deliberate forgery. Holmes adjusted the angle once more, his thin lips compressed in concentration. Gradually, with the aid of his glass, the sentences emerged, incomplete, yet sufficient to betray their tenor. "Observe," he said. "The matter is settled. He will not dare speak. Payment upon delivery." These words, Watson, were never penned by you, yet they bear the very form of your script. I stared in astonishment, for indeed the strokes resembled my own, but with a precision almost too exact, as though each letter had been carved rather than written. Holmes tapped the page lightly. "Here lies the betraying feature. Your hand, my dear fellow, has a natural fluency, the ease of long habit. These lines, by contrast, are overstudied. Each letter is an imitation, performed with effort, the spacing too uniform, the pressure unnaturally constant. It is Watson's hand." I confess that a shudder passed over me as I regarded those spectral phrases. To think that another had not only usurped my handwriting, but turned it to such sinister purposes, filled me with indignation and dread. Yet Holmes, with his usual calm, merely closed the diary and set it upon the table. "We are upon the scent, Watson. This phantom ink, these impressions unintended by the forger, point to a hand close at yours in daily life, one who has had ample occasion to observe and practice your script. The mystery tightens, and with it the noose around the true culprit." Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers lightly steepled, the ghostly impressions still fresh upon his mind. "Consider, Watson," said he, "the remarkable precision of this forgery. To mimic another's hand is no small accomplishment. It requires not merely a glance at specimens, but prolonged familiarity, the kind born of daily observation. Who, then, has had such access to your notes, prescriptions, or casual jottings? Not a stranger, certainly, but one near enough to handle your writing often, to study unconsciously the peculiar turns of your pen." I reflected uneasily upon his words. "It is true," I admitted, "that over the years I have entrusted many letters, memoranda and prescriptions to others, clerks, assistants, even patients, but none, I should have thought, with the motive to fashion such an outrage." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his keen eyes fixed upon me. "Motive, my dear Watson, is ever the veil which conceals the hand, but the familiarity required here narrows the circle greatly. The forger must have been one accustomed to your correspondence, one who not only beheld but handled it. That intimacy speaks of proximity, and proximity of trust." He rose and paced slowly across the room, the diary in his hand. "It is here that the matter takes on its true complexion. The Fenton family themselves, with their bitterness and wounded pride, make a convenient target for suspicion that yields the truth. The forger sought to clothe himself in your hand, yet betrayed his art in that very striving. Thus we move from shadow to substance, from false appearance to certainty, and in that certainty,
The path before us grows clearer. I could not help but marvel, as so often before, at the ease with which Holmes had turned a seeming trifle, the ghost of ink pressed upon a page, into a conclusion of weight and direction. Where I had seen nothing but confusion, he had drawn a net about the culprit, and with a quiet triumph that admitted no vanity, prepared us for the next step in the inquiry. As the appointed night drew on, Holmes and I found ourselves once more at the Fenton estate, admitted by a servant whose subdued manner betrayed little curiosity at our unusual request. Holmes had contrived, with Eleanor and her brother, that we might be left to our own devices within the house after nightfall, and thus it was that we took our places in a darkened corridor, which commanded a view both of the study and of the main staircase. Holmes, with his customary foresight, had chosen our station with an exactness that would admit no accident. There, in the stillness of that shadowed passage, we composed ourselves for a vigil of uncertain duration. The hours crept slowly onward, and with them came the peculiar oppression of a house at night. The silence was not complete, for the old timbers gave forth an occasional groan as they settled in the damp air, and the draughts that stirred through the corridors sighed like whispers, half overheard. Each sound, however trivial, seemed magnified by the intensity of our waiting. Once, the distant bark of a dog rang out across the grounds, and I started despite myself, only to meet Holmes's calm glance, which conveyed, without words, both reassurance and a silent rebuke to my nervousness. The fire in the study had burned low, casting but a dull glow upon the furniture, while the rest of the house lay in shadow. It was as though the walls themselves conspired to deepen. Midnight came and passed with funereal solemnity, the old clock upon the landing tolling the hour in strokes that reverberated like a knell through the empty rooms. My nerves, strung to their utmost tension, quivered at every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lamp. I confess that the long silence pressed upon me with a weight I found almost intolerable. Holmes, by contrast, remained unmoved, his tall figure bent slightly forward, his eyes fixed unwaveringly upon the darkened hall beyond. It was as if he were carved from stone, his patience inexhaustible, his vigilance unbroken. In that stillness I marvelled once more at the iron discipline of his mind, which could maintain a single point of attention, while mine fluttered at every trivial sound. It was in the depth of that oppressive silence, when the hour had grown wearisome even to my strained senses, that a faint sound broke the stillness. I started, scarcely daring to breathe. Somewhere along the passage, a board creaked beneath a cautious step. Holmes's hand touched my sleeve lightly, a signal for absolute quiet. Together we listened as the faint footfalls, slow and measured, drew nearer. Presently, through the dimness, I discerned the outline of a figure gliding with deliberate stealth towards the study. The movement was furtive, the poise betraying an intent carefully concealed. The shadow paused as though to assure itself of solitude, and then slipped within the study door. We waited a breath longer, until the soft rustle of papers told us that the intruder was at work. Then, inch by inch, Holmes drew me forward. From the darkness of the corridor we looked into the room beyond. By the dull glow of the dying fire we saw the figure, a woman, her form bent over the desk. With trembling fingers she drew forth a bundle of papers from a secret recess beneath the drawer. Her movements were hurried, out of her. Holmes straightened, his features grave and composed, the captured documents secure in his grasp. "So, Mrs. Arden," said he with quiet finality, "the shadows have yielded their secret, and the truth no longer lies hidden in your silence." The woman, trembling violently, sank into the chair by the fire, the glow of the embers casting upon her face the unmistakable stamp of guilt. The long night of waiting had brought its reward. The culprit was revealed. Mrs. Arden was conducted to the study, where Holmes bade her sit in the armchair by the smouldering fire. She obeyed without protest, her frame shaking, her face drained of colour. The bundle of papers, now safely in Holmes's keeping, seemed to have robbed her of what little strength remained. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the floor, a silence heavy with the burden of things unspoken. Holmes regarded her with an expression at once stern and compassionate, the gaze of one who recognizes in guilt both the crime and the suffering it entails. At first, when questioned, she met his inquiries with stammered denials. I know nothing of these writings," she said. "The diary is no concern of mine. I only sought to keep the household from further scandal." Her voice faltered, but Holmes pressed gently yet firmly, his tone devoid of anger, but weighted with certainty. "You were observed with these papers in hand, Mrs. Arden. You attempted their destruction. Such acts speak louder than any denial. The truth, however painful, must be uttered tonight." At his words, she shrank deeper into the chair, her lips trembling, her eyes brimming with tears held resolutely in check. I confess, I felt a stir of pity for the woman, even as I recognized the enormity of her deception. Holmes's questions continued with measured persistence, each one striking nearer to the hidden core of her guilt. At length her defences crumbled. Her voice, low and broken, confessed what her silence could no longer conceal. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew. I wrote those lines. I tried to bury the past before it rose again to destroy me." The last words escaped her in a sob, and her head sank into her hands. The mask of dignity, maintained through years of service and secrecy, had fallen away, revealing a soul weary with shame. Holmes allowed a moment of silence before speaking. "There is more," said he softly. "You have carried a burden that belongs not to the Fenton family, but to yourself. Speak freely, Mrs. Arden, for concealment serves you no longer." She raised her head suddenly, her eyes blazing with the anguish of long-suppressed memory. "Yes," she cried, "I was the mistress of that nobleman, the one who brought the snuff-box to this house. To him I gave my youth, and from him I received only betrayal. When he came here, flaunting his station, I resolved he should not leave unscathed. I took the box, yes, I, not Mr. Fenton, and when suspicion fell upon the master of the house, I let it rest there, for I dared not draw the gaze upon myself. From that hour my life has been one of fear and secrecy. I thought to silence the past by fabricating the diary, by weaving guilt around others. But the past, Mr. Holmes, has a voice that cannot be hushed." The words poured from her in a torrent, her bitterness mingled with remorse. I sat in sombre reflection, struck by the ruinous power of a single reckless act, and by the years of degradation that had followed in its wake. Holmes, grave and attentive, inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the truth and the tragedy of her confession. Her confession, once begun, seemed to press upon her with an irresistible force. Rumours threatened to rise again. I saw no other way to protect myself. I forged those passages in Dr. Watson's hand, thinking to weave a net around the family's name, to make the world believe it was their disgrace, not mine. It was folly, desperate folly. I thought to silence suspicion by redirecting it, but instead I drew the net tighter about myself. She buried her face in her hands once more, the enormity of her actions overwhelming her. I confess I could not repress a pang of indignation that my name had been so wantonly misused, though pity tempered my anger as I beheld her abject state. When she raised her head again, her voice was harsher, tinged with long-nursed bitterness. "You cannot know," she said,
what it is to serve a family, to labour unseen in their comfort while envy gnaws at the heart. They had respectability, a good name, a place in society. I was nothing, save a servant and a discarded woman. Yes, I pitied Eleanor, but I could not help the resentment that festered in me. If they bore disgrace, it was no more than I had borne in silence all my life. Her eyes flashed as she spoke, and I saw in her words that strange mingling of guilt and spite, shame and envy, which made her at once pitiable and culpable. Holmes listened in silence, his long fingers resting lightly upon the incriminating bundle. When she had ceased, he rose with grave composure. "Your tale, Mrs. Arden, accords with the evidence," said he. "The theft of the snuff-box, the forged passages, the attempt to destroy these papers, each finds its place in your account. It is not for me to judge you. The law must have its course. Yet I will say this: justice often dwells in the unlikeliest hearts of the guilty, and truth, though delayed, has at last emerged from the shadows. You have unburdened yourself tonight. Whether that shall ease or torment you further lies in the reckoning of your conscience." She bowed her head, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs, while Holmes placed the papers carefully within his case. The matter, so long obscured by rumour and deception, had been brought into the light, though its revelation carried with it a melancholy that even vindication could not wholly dispel. When at last we returned to Baker Street, it was with the weary satisfaction of men who had seen a tangled skein unravelled, though not without melancholy in the unravelling. The familiar sight of our chambers greeted us with a comfort I cannot too highly praise. The glow of the fire, the quiet tick of the clock, the faint aroma of Holmes's tobacco. After the shadowed corridors of the Fenton estate, its air thick with bitterness and secrecy, our sitting room seemed a haven of order and repose. I confess that I felt a profound relief in sinking into my accustomed chair, for the events of the past nights had pressed heavily upon my spirit. Holmes, with characteristic economy of gesture, drew the disputed diary from his case and laid it upon the desk. For a while he stood gazing at it, his tall figure outlined against the firelight, his expression one of grave contemplation. "An unassuming object," he said at length, "yet capable of wrecking lives. See how a mere volume, intended for the quiet record of daily existence, becomes the instrument of fraud, of shame, of misplaced suspicion, the very tool of truth." Deeply moved by his words, my own sense of relief was great, for the shadow which had hung over my name was lifted, and with it the unjust stain upon the Fentons. I thought of Miss Eleanor's pale, earnest face, and was thankful that her family's honour, so long clouded, had been restored by the revelation of the true culprit. For myself, I felt an inward gratitude that Holmes's vigilance and sagacity had preserved me from a dishonour into which the craft of another had so cunningly sought to plunge me. Holmes, with a decisive gesture, closed the diary and placed it upon the shelf, where it lay with other relics of our cases, mute witnesses to human folly and human cunning. No further word was spoken between us. The fire sank low upon the hearth, the shadows deepened across the room, and we sat in a silence more eloquent than speech. In that quietude, I reflected that justice, however tardy, had at last prevailed, and that in the unmasking of falsehood, there resides always a certain reverence for truth. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the closed diary resting on the desk beside him, and for a moment the firelight caught the sharpness of his profile. "You see, Watson," he said, "it was never the ink, nor the flourish of the letters that gave weight to those words, but the integrity behind them. Strip away that integrity, and even the most perfect imitation collapses under scrutiny. A falsehood may wear the garments of truth, but it cannot endure the test of reason." I murmured agreement, reflecting on the bitter course of events that had led from a stolen snuff-box to a servant's lifelong shame. But what do you think was Mrs. Arden's gravest error? The theft itself, the years of silence that followed, or the desperate attempt to forge another man's hand? Share your thoughts below. I'd be eager to know your view. If you enjoyed this case, let me invite you to comment, subscribe, and share the story with those who delight in the puzzle.